Chapter 1. The Summer Garden Club Luncheon. It was a perfect July afternoon in the village of Little Dithering. Just the sort of day where nothing dreadful should happen. The sky was blue as the hydrangeas blooming along the picket fences, and the scent of honeysuckle drifted lazily over the cricket field where Mr. Lambert's grandson was making an impressively poor showing. The Women's Garden Club luncheon was in full swing in the vicarage garden, hosted with great pride by Mrs. Edith Carmody, whose begonias were the only things louder than her voice. A long white table was spread with cucumber sandwiches, cream scones, and neat slices of Battenberg cake, while pitchers of elderflower cordial sweated quietly in the shade. It was there, under a striped parasol, that Miss Jane Marple sat, knitting in hand, ears alert and blue eyes quietly cataloguing the scene. The old lace shawl draped over her shoulders seemed too warm for the day, but she never minded. It was all part of the image. You see? Slightly dotty, quietly inconspicuous. She much preferred people speaking freely around her. "Oh, did you hear?" whispered Mrs. Graves from the Methodist choir, leaning towards her companion. "The new American lodger up at the Crooked Beeches, never married, drives her own car, and I've heard she drinks gin with her breakfast." "Shocking," murmured her friend, "and her name is Crystal, of all things." Miss Marple did not look up, but she filed the detail neatly away, as she always did. Crystal Newhouse had arrived only 3 weeks ago, renting the top floor of the old manor house that had once belonged to the Harcourt family. She'd attended church twice, wearing red lipstick and laughing too loudly during the sermon. The village was still deciding what to make of her. The luncheon was nearing its conclusion, with speeches about heritage roses just beginning to lull the audience into a gentle daze, when a scream shattered the summer calm. It came from the direction of the house, specifically the side garden just beyond the French doors. A piercing, desperate sound, unmistakably feminine. Chairs scraped back, teacups clattered to the grass. Miss Marple rose as best she could, steadied by her parasol. It was Lily Hawkins, the vicar's young maid, white as bone and clutching her apron in trembling hands. It's her, in the study. Mrs. Carmody, she's dead." Gasps rippled like a wave across the garden. Within minutes, the guests surged inside in a disorderly cluster, but the vicar, bless him, herded them back. Only a few were permitted through. The village doctor, summoned from the luncheon crowd, confirmed it quickly. Mrs. Carmody was dead, slumped over her late husband's desk, her lips stained with what looked suspiciously like blackberry cordial. Or was it? Miss Marple remained near the threshold, quietly observing. There was a smell in the air, a sickly sweetness that didn't belong in a vicarage study. She noticed the window was open, though the day wasn't yet warm enough for that, and the door leading to the side pantry stood ajar. Odd, because that pantry had been sealed off years ago during renovations. No one had used it since, or rather, no one should have. Someone whispered, "She had enemies, you know. That business with the flower show prize last year." Another muttered, "Her will's been the talk of the solicitor's office for months." The village of Little Dithering had just lost its most opinionated resident, and while the doctor murmured about heart failure and the police were yet to arrive, Miss Marple gently set her knitting on the arm of a chair and turned toward the unused pantry door. There had never been a door built on that side, not since the manor's plans were changed in 1894. So why had she just seen muddy footprints leading out from it? Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. The death of Mrs. Edith Carmody had spread through Little Dithering faster than the summer storm that rolled in that evening, though unlike the storm, the gossip showed no signs of passing. By 6 o'clock, the vicarage gates had been latched shut. The constable had taken statements from most of the luncheon guests, and the village doctor had solemnly declared the death unexpected, but not implausible for a woman of her constitution. A preliminary note of natural causes was jotted down, but no one truly believed it. Not in Little Dithering. Heart failure? Mrs. Penelope Finch scoffed over her supper table that night. Rubbish. Edith was a tyrant, but a healthy one. Walked to church every Sunday without fail, and she still carried coal in from the shed herself. She did have high blood pressure, offered her husband, trying to slice his meatloaf unnoticed. She also had enemies, Penelope sniffed. Half the committee hated her, and the other half owed her money or favors, and don't think I didn't notice that Crystal woman leaving early. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by her fireside in St. Mary Mead, her niece having dropped her off only an hour ago, was knitting something soft in pale gray wool. Not that she could focus. Her mind was, as always, weaving something altogether more complicated. She'd seen the panic behind Lily, the maid's wide eyes. And she'd noted how Mr. Carmichael, the widower with a fondness for Edith's peach cobbler, had arrived suspiciously late to the luncheon, and alone, despite having promised to bring his cousin from Stoke-on-Trent. But it was the door that wasn't there which intrigued her most. Miss Marple had visited the vicarage dozens of times over the years. The side pantry had once been part of the old Harcourt servant quarters, unused and boarded since the late 1890s, when the kitchen was modernized. There had never been a door from the study into that space. The layout simply didn't allow it. And yet today, she'd seen muddy boot prints trailing out from it and into the corridor, as if someone had slipped through, unseen, unnoticed. She intended to inquire further, of course, but not immediately. One must always allow the village to speak first. People gave themselves away so easily in the days following a tragedy. And speak they did. The following morning, the post office was abuzz. Miss Withers, who ran the telegram counter with unnerving precision, had already formed her theory. It was poisoning. Obvious, really. Probably in the cordial. Did you see the color of her lips? Miss Hartnell, who had once studied nursing before deciding the war wasn't for her, disagreed. It looked like a seizure, maybe a fit. Poor woman. It's always the nice ones who die, sighed Miss Withers. Miss Hartnell blinked. You didn't like Mrs. Carmody? No, said Miss Withers firmly. But I respected her. There's a difference. By mid-morning, the constable, young Sergeant Darlow, full of ambition and pressed trousers, had taken a more serious tone. He'd requested a post-mortem and sealed off the study. The phrase suspicious circumstances had begun to emerge, albeit in hushed tones. He also paid a polite visit to Miss Marple, who offered him a cup of tea and asked whether he'd considered the footprints. Footprints, ma'am? Darlow blinked. Pen paused above his notepad. In the study, she said gently, her tone that of someone remarking on the weather. Leading out from the wall where the pantry once was. Very curious. I expect you'll take a look, won't you? Of course, Miss Marple. We'll be thorough. She gave a kind smile and returned to her knitting. She didn't expect him to understand the significance, not yet. But he was a good boy. He'd get there, eventually. Elsewhere, conversations continued. At the butcher's, Mr. Bowditch loudly declared it was definitely the Americans, his thumb jerking toward the upper village, always poking their noses in, bringing strange habits. That Miss Newhouse's trouble, wearing trousers like a man. You mark my words. Meanwhile, Miss Newhouse, Crystal, as she insisted on being called, was sitting in the corner booth at the Crooked Mug, sipping lukewarm coffee and keeping her back to the wall. She looked tired. The cafe owner, Rosamond Trent, tried to offer sympathy. But the American's face was set. I didn't even like the woman, Crystal muttered. She thought I was here to swindle her out of the property. She told me so, twice. Did she? Rosamond said, raising a brow. Crystal nodded. Said I had no place here. That I'd never understand English gardens or English morals. Can you imagine? Rosamond could, actually. She'd been on the receiving end of Edith Carmody's moral standards herself. By the afternoon, the village was in full theorizing mode. Theories included poisoning, by the cordial, by the cake, or by the vicar's wife, depending on whom you asked. A burglary gone wrong, though nothing appeared to be stolen. Revenge for the flower show debacle of 1948, and the most exotic witchcraft proposed by old Mrs. Liddle, who still believed the Roman well beneath the church was cursed. Miss Marple, for her part, took a slow walk through the village, stopping by the greengrocer for apples and exchanging pleasantries with nearly everyone. She made no inquiries, but she listened. It was incredible what people revealed when they thought they weren't being questioned. She told me she was updating her will, whispered Mrs. Copley, the solicitor's assistant, to her sister. Said she wanted to cut out the parasites, whatever that meant. "Did you hear about the old ledger in the vicar's study?" murmured Lily the maid to her cousin. She kept it locked up, pages and pages of village notes, like a black book. And later, at tea with the vicar's wife, Miss Marple simply commented, "I wonder who stood to inherit Mrs. Carmody's property." The vicarage is church-owned, of course, but she still had her family estate, didn't she? "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Featherstone, frowning. "She never sold it, though she did mention she'd made adjustments recently." Miss Marple gave a small nod, eyes resting thoughtfully on her half-eaten scone. Adjustments, mud where there should be stone, a door where there should be none, cordial that looked far too crimson, and a village full of theories, motives, and secrets. She didn't have the answer yet, but she had something far more useful. A dozen lies dressed up as truth. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. It was 2 days after the Garden Club luncheon that Miss Marple found herself once again outside the vicarage gate. The morning was grey and drizzly, the sort of English dampness that made bones ache and roses sag. The village, though still humming with speculation, had quieted ever so slightly. The novelty of death always gave way to routine, even if the questions lingered like fog on the cricket field. Miss Marple had arranged to deliver a basket of plum preserves to Mrs. Featherstone, the vicar's wife, who had looked quite worn at Sunday's brief service. Miss Marple had always believed that gifts should appear to be about kindness, not curiosity. And so, with preserves carefully wrapped in muslin and tied with blue ribbon, she stepped onto the cobbled path. "Miss Marple?" Mrs. Featherstone greeted her with a warm but distracted smile. "How lovely. Come in, do. Oh, the whole house still feels heavy somehow. I can't describe it, and poor Lily jumps every time the floor creaks." As they moved through the hallway, Miss Marple noticed a faint stain on the wallpaper outside the study door. Something dark had seeped into the baseboards there. She said nothing, only gave a sympathetic murmur. In the drawing room, tea had been set with evident haste. The spoons didn't match, and the milk jug had a small chip Miss Marple had never seen before. "You must be exhausted, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, easing into a faded armchair. "Oh, I am. You wouldn't believe the questions the police asked. Sergeant Darlow has been terribly thorough. He even had someone measure the pantry walls with a spirit level. Apparently, they're checking for cavities. Can you imagine? A hidden room." "Cavities," Miss Marple repeated gently, as if the word were a riddle. "And did they find one?" "No, nothing. Just the old bricks. Still, Lily swears she saw someone coming from that side of the house. She's been quite unsettled." "And what of the cordial?" Mrs. Featherstone leaned in, voice lowering. "They took it for testing, some sort of compound they didn't recognize. Sergeant Darlow says the coroner will have results by Friday." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was already steps ahead. A poison no one recognized. A door that didn't exist, and a woman who, by all accounts, was both feared and deeply resented. She left the vicarage an hour later, having made soft noises about the strain of recent days and how she hoped Lily was getting her rest. In truth, she doubted the girl had slept properly since the incident, but Miss Marple wasn't done yet. Her next stop was the Crooked Beeches. The manor house loomed in its usual faded grandeur at the edge of the village, wrapped in ivy and shadow. Built in the early 1800s and added to in fits and starts over the decades, the place had a patchwork architecture that made it easy to get lost in, even for those who lived there. Crystal Newhouse answered the door in a navy jumper and corduroy trousers, a cigarette tucked behind one ear. "Miss Marple," she said warily. "Didn't expect you." "Just a short visit, my dear. I do so like to check in on new arrivals, especially after such a dreadful event." Crystal hesitated. "Come in, then. Kitchen's warm." The interior was cooler than expected. No fire in the front room, and the air held the faint scent of old paper and lemon polish. Crystal led her through to the kitchen where the kettle was already hissing. "I was just making tea," she said, as if embarrassed to be caught doing something so ordinary. "Haven't been able to settle. You know how it is." Miss Marple gave a soft chuckle. "Oh, yes. I find tea settles the nerves more than anything else. You're quite alone here, aren't you?" Crystal nodded, pouring hot water into mismatched mugs. "It's peaceful, usually. I wanted quiet after the divorce. A clean slate. This place seemed perfect. And you knew no one here at all?" "Not a soul." "And yet Mrs. Carmody disliked you from the start." Crystal froze. "Yes, she did." "Did you quarrel?" Crystal sat down opposite her. "She came here once. Said I was a distraction to the village, that women like me made men forget their obligations." "Can you imagine?" Miss Marple regarded her carefully. "Oh, I think I can." "She was jealous, you know," Crystal added, eyes flashing. "Not of me, but of change, of time." I reminded her the world had moved on. "Did you ever visit the vicarage before the luncheon?" "No, that was my first time." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And had you ever spoken to Lily, the maid?" Crystal blinked. "No, I don't think so." "Why?" "Oh, no reason. She mentioned seeing someone unfamiliar near the pantry entrance, a person she said she didn't recognize. You weren't near the house before the others arrived, were you?" Crystal stiffened slightly. "I walked through the garden." "That's all?" Miss Marple didn't push. She merely asked to use the washroom before leaving, and Crystal gave directions with a distracted nod. But instead of heading to the guest loo, Miss Marple took a brief detour, pausing by a stack of unopened boxes in the hall. One of them was labeled Harcourt Estate Records. Another, curiously, was marked 1935 Blueprints, Crooked Beaches Extension. She didn't touch anything, of course, but she noted it. As she returned to the kitchen, Crystal was already at the sink, back turned. "Thank you for the tea, dear," Miss Marple said gently. "It's been so helpful to talk." Back in her own cottage, Miss Marple began to chart the story. Mrs. Carmody had enemies. That much was clear, but motive alone was rarely enough to point to a killer. Opportunity and knowledge mattered just as much. Who knew the house well enough to forge an exit from a sealed room? Who had access to poisons that could mimic natural failure but leave no clear trace? And who would benefit, truly benefit, from Edith Carmody's sudden and very public death? The village believed the answer lay in resentment, or revenge, or petty squabbles over flower shows and wills. But Miss Marple suspected something older, something built before the door, something hidden for decades behind stone. Chapter 4, First Suspects. By Thursday morning, Sergeant Darlow had what he believed to be his first real lead, or rather, his first convenient lead. It came in the form of a folded statement from Lily Hawkins, the vicar's maid, scribbled nervously in pencil and handed over with shaking fingers. According to Lily, she had seen a figure near the pantry door not long before the scream rang out. The figure had been tall, wearing a dark jacket, possibly navy or black, and had moved away quickly when noticed. That alone might have stirred some curiosity, but it was the detail Lily added at the very end that made Darlow sit up straight. She had glimpsed what she believed to be red hair. "Crystal Newhouse," Darlow muttered, reaching for the police register. It was hardly a secret. Crystal's auburn waves were as much a topic of conversation as her American accent and her trousers. In fact, in a village as conservative as Little Dithering, her very existence seemed to qualify as suspicious. Later that afternoon, Crystal was brought in for a polite conversation, as Darlow phrased it, though the tone was considerably firmer than his words suggested. Miss Marple, who had heard of the development before tea was even brewed at the post office, merely sighed into her cup. "How quick we are to blame the unfamiliar," she murmured to Mrs. Bletchley, who sat across from her with a scone half raised. "Red hair, you say? I seem to recall the greengrocer's nephew has the same shade. Was wearing his cricket jacket at the luncheon, dark navy, but of course he's local, so it couldn't possibly be him." Mrs. Bletchley blinked, her scorn forgotten. "You mean George? He's barely 17. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Even 17-year-olds have secrets. At the station, Crystal sat in a stiff-backed chair, her arms folded, one foot twitching impatiently. "I didn't go inside the vicarage," she said for the third time. "I was in the garden, drinking that horrible cordial and trying to avoid Mrs. Carmody altogether." "Lily Hawkins says she saw someone matching your description," Darlow replied. "Polite but firm." "Matching it how?" Crystal snapped. "I'm not the only redhead in England. And what time was this supposed to be?" She wasn't certain of the time. Just before the scream, she thinks. Crystal leaned back, eyes sharp. "If this is about me being an outsider, just say it." Darlow flushed. "It isn't." "Then maybe find out who really wanted her dead. Because if you think I'm the only one who couldn't stand her, you haven't been listening." That gave him pause. "What do you mean?" Crystal rolled her eyes. "Come on, the entire garden club hated her, and don't pretend you didn't know about the will. She threatened half the town with it. Said she was going to make some revisions. I even heard she was trying to force that poor maid out, accused her of theft." Darlow blinked. "Lily, I hadn't heard that." "Well, maybe you should ask Lily how often she cried in the tool shed." Meanwhile, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the solicitor's office. Mr. Braithwaite, the town's long-serving legal mind, looked up from a stack of dusty folders as she entered. He was a small man with glasses that always seemed to be slipping down his nose, and a voice like a wheezing accordion. "Miss Marple, come to amend your will again?" he joked. "Not this time, dear," she said, taking a seat. "I was wondering, purely from idle curiosity, whether you'd handled any recent changes to Mrs. Carmody's affairs." He hesitated. "That's confidential, you know." "Of course. But one does hear whispers, and I do remember Mrs. Carmody telling me, rather pointedly, that she wouldn't leave a halfpenny to ungrateful blood." Braithwaite sighed. "Well, I suppose it's no great secret now. She had drafted a new will. He hadn't signed it, mind you, but it was on my desk, waiting for her final approval." "And who stood to benefit?" "An educational fund," he said, eyes weary. "And a small trust for Lily. The rest was to go to the church." Miss Marple arched an eyebrow. "That's surprisingly generous of her." "Indeed, especially given what the previous will said." "And what did that one say?" "Everything to her nephew, Roland Carmody. A dreadful man, if I may say so." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She remembered Roland, 35, always behind on his rent, and once caught cheating at whist. Not the sort of man who appreciated being disinherited. "Was he at the luncheon?" "No," said Braithwaite. "Out of the country, last I heard. Spain or Portugal. But likely aware that he was being written out." Braithwaite hesitated again. "It's possible. He'd written her 2 letters recently, rather desperate in tone." That evening, Miss Marple sat at her window, watching as the rain began to fall gently against the glass. In her lap, the grey wool had been abandoned, her thoughts too tangled for knitting. So far, the suspects the village focused on were the ones they wanted to blame: the American lodger, the redhead in trousers, the outsider. But true guilt rarely wore such obvious clothing. There was Lily, frightened, perhaps with reason. She had motive if she'd truly been mistreated. Then again, there was Roland, with a very strong reason to act and no clear alibi. But how would he have gotten into the pantry or slipped into the study unnoticed? And what of Mr. Carmichael, Edith's old admirer, who had arrived late to the luncheon and had quietly slipped away before the police were called? Too many possibilities and yet not enough truth. And always her mind circled back to that impossible door. A door that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. Where had it led? Who had passed through it? And why had someone gone to the trouble of concealing it for decades, only to use it now? She jotted a few notes in her small diary and underlined one phrase 3 times. Not the door itself, but who knew it wasn't meant to be there? The real killer, she suspected, was not hiding behind loud gossip or easy anger. The real killer had planned, had calculated, had waited for a moment where the entire village was distracted, a moment where cordial and cake would be served, where no one would see the hand slipping poison into a glass, or the boots stepping through stone. Chapter 5. The Obvious Suspect. By the following morning, St. Hedwig's Lane was alight with speculation, and the scent of scandal drifted more pungently than the blooming honeysuckle. The news of Henry Gibbs's sudden demise had already spread beyond Little Weetham's borders, reaching the neighboring villages like a tea-stained postcard passed hand to hand. At the Bellflower Inn, gossip was served alongside scones and jam, and in the corner pews of St. Clement's Church, murmurs swelled more fervently than the Sunday hymns. But nowhere was the gossip more determined than in the tidy parlour of Mrs. Agatha Cramley, whose embroidery circle had met with unusual promptness and unprecedented numbers that Tuesday afternoon. "I dare say it was poisoning," she whispered with the gleeful gravity of someone announcing a royal engagement. "You remember how pale he looked? Green about the gills, very suspicious." "Or a heart attack," offered Mrs. Barton sensibly, though she clearly found the former theory more entertaining. "He was terribly red-faced of late, and puffing like a train." Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window with her knitting, offered a small, distracted smile. Her needles clicked gently, but her eyes were alert beneath her delicate brows. It was all very interesting, the way people leapt to conclusions. But she had always said, in a village like Little Witham, one learned more from watching how people behaved than from what they said, especially when they thought they were not being watched. Inspector Crail, meanwhile, had already latched on to a theory. "We've got our man," he told Constable Bell as they made their way back from the Gibbs residence. "Or very likely, our woman." Constable Bell raised an eyebrow. "You mean Florence Snipe," Crail said with a firm nod. "The housekeeper. Who else had such easy access to him? Lived under his roof, knew his habits, knew where the brandy was kept, likely dosed it. They say he took his usual evening glass before he dropped dead." Bell hesitated. "She's been with him over 20 years. Seems loyal enough. And the doctor hasn't confirmed poisoning, sir." Crail waved this aside. "Means, motive, opportunity. She ticks the lot. There's always something under those silent ones. Mark my words, she's hiding something." In truth, Florence Snipe had not been arrested, yet, but she had been invited to the station for a routine chat. She'd gone without protest, a woman made of oak and stillness, dressed in her serviceable grey dress and plain hat. When asked about her employer's death, she'd replied evenly, "I didn't expect him to die that evening, but I can't say I'm surprised he did." That had caught Crail's attention. "Meaning?" Florence had looked at him squarely. He'd been seeing things, talking to himself, jumping at noises that weren't there. A man that anxious isn't long for this world. Crail had written it down as possible deflection. Miss Marple, when she heard this later from her nephew's friend in the police clerical office, who was very fond of her sponge cake, filed it away in her memory. Not deflection, she thought, but something more curious. Back in the village, the other residents were far from convinced that Florence Snipe was capable of murder. "She may be a bit stiff," said Reverend Winstanley, "but evil. I've seen her pick up wounded birds and carry them home to tend." "She helped me when I lost my cat," murmured young Dotty Muse, whose voice barely rose above the teacup she held. "I was crying and she came round with broth and a blanket. Just sat with me." But a counter-theory was beginning to form, one that gained traction even quicker than Crale's. "It's the nephew," whispered Mrs. Bra, cramly as she poured another round of Darjeeling. "The American." Mr. Allen Gibbs had arrived that morning, rather inconveniently in time to be noticed. With his expensive shoes and camera bag, he was seen as too smooth, too sudden, and far too charming. He hadn't seen his uncle in over a decade, yet here he was, just as the will was due to be updated. "Flights from New York don't just happen, you know," Mrs. Cramley declared to her circle. "He must have planned it." Miss Marple said nothing. But she remembered Allen Gibbs well. He had been a wiry boy with quick fingers and a love of climbing trees, often barefoot. She recalled him stealing cherries from the vicarage tree once and then apologizing with a rather beautiful drawing of it. And when he came to the funeral that afternoon in a grey suit slightly too thin for English weather, he knelt a moment longer than necessary before the coffin, not theatrically, just thoughtfully. She noted it. The funeral was a small, stiff affair. A few polite tears, a few perfunctory condolences, and one conspicuous absence. Florence Snipe. "I didn't feel it appropriate," she had said when Miss Marple inquired. "It wouldn't have looked right, and it wouldn't have felt honest." That, too, stayed with Miss Marple. So did the way Allen Gibbs looked around the village afterward, as if searching for something besides memories, or someone. He stopped outside the hardware shop, peering at the faded list of deliveries. He bought a newspaper and asked a strange question about recent property sales. And then he walked past the old vicarage and paused for a full minute before the crumbling west wall. And that evening, when most of the town had gone quiet and the sky turned a dull mauve, he knocked, of all places, on Miss Marple's door. "I hoped you'd remember me," he said with a crooked smile. "You're Miss Marple, aren't you? The lady who once told me nettles don't sting if you pick them boldly?" "Quite true, though one must still wash one's hands after," she replied, ushering him in. He glanced around the room with something like nostalgia. "I don't think my uncle died naturally, and I'm not here for the money. I'm here because someone wanted him quiet." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. "And why would you believe that?" she asked. He pulled something from his coat pocket, an old letter, badly folded, the edges torn. "Because he wrote to me last month and said he'd finally seen something." "Something behind the bricked-up door in the west wing?" Miss Marple blinked. "But dear boy, there was never a door there." Allen looked up. "Exactly." Chapter 6. The edge of the teacup, Miss Marple sat in her parlor with a teacup balanced delicately on its saucer, steam rising gently into the quiet room. The lace curtains fluttered with the afternoon breeze, and outside, the birds sang as if the world had not just witnessed the shocking murder of Edward Hargreaves. Inside the village, however, life had taken on a different tone. Hushed conversations, hurried glances, and an undercurrent of unease that Miss Marple had seen before, many times. It was the same tremor that ran through human nature when polite facades trembled under the weight of suspicion. The funeral had been held that morning, short, restrained, and tense. The villagers had turned out in proper dress and somber faces, but their eyes wandered over each other with veiled curiosity. Miss Marple had taken it all in, quietly, as she always did. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock returned to St. Mary Mead. Though young and slightly impatient, he had a grudging respect for Miss Marple's observations. She, in turn, appreciated his honest effort, even if he looked for clues where none were needed. "I must say," he began, taking the cup of tea offered to him, "the entire household at Heather Ridge is a nest of tension. There's something off about that whole place. I'm beginning to think the daughter, Miss Evelina, knows more than she admits. She was close to her father, but not in the usual way. It's odd." Miss Marple smiled. "Young ladies often carry the burden of protecting others, Inspector, and sometimes protection takes the form of silence." Craddock looked at her over his cup. "Are you suggesting she's hiding something?" "I'm suggesting," said Miss Marple gently, "that you should not confuse reserve with guilt. People don't always lie out of malice, you know. Sometimes they lie for love." Before Craddock could respond, the doorbell rang. Mary, Miss Marple's long-suffering maid, answered. "Mr. Leonard Tyburn," she announced, as if the name were vinegar on her tongue. The young architect entered stiffly, hat in hand. His face was pale, his collar tight around his throat. "I'm sorry to intrude, Miss Marple," he said, "but I thought you might want to know something about the Hargreaves property. I was in charge of the renovations, you see, including the garden wall." Miss Marple gestured kindly to the chair across from her. "Do sit, Mr. Tyburn. Tea?" "No, thank you. I wanted to set something straight." He hesitated. "There's been talk about the door in the garden wall that doesn't open." Craddock leaned forward slightly. "Yes, it's been a topic of interest. Well, it wasn't part of my plan. I submitted drawings for a proper archway with a gate, something aesthetic, you know. But Mr. Hargreaves insisted on bricking it up, said it was for effect. It didn't make much sense, but he was firm. He even supervised it himself." "Did he ever explain why?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes never leaving his face. Tyburn shook his head. "Only that it was important the wall looked symmetrical. He even had me use older bricks to make it appear weathered, but it always seemed odd to me. A fake door where a real one would have served no less purpose." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Fascinating. Thank you, Miss Tyburn. And how long ago was this?" 2 years, almost exactly." After he left, Craddock frowned. So, Hargreaves had a fake door built in his garden wall, specifically designed to appear old and unused. It's not merely aesthetic. That's planning. Miss Marple nodded. "Planning indeed. Perhaps even secrecy. You see, people go to great lengths to hide a thing in plain sight when it must never be found." Craddock rubbed his temples. "But why? A bricked-up doorway doesn't kill a man." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a smile. "No, but it may reveal why someone did." Later that evening, the atmosphere in Heather Ridge was tight as a drawn wire. Miss Marple had accepted a polite invitation for tea from Evelina, who seemed eager to prove herself socially attentive despite her recent bereavement. The young woman poured tea with the grace of one who had been taught young and thoroughly. Her eyes were tired, ringed with shadows, and her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't suppose the police have found anything new?" she asked. "I expect they're pursuing all possibilities," Miss Marple replied. "You were very close to your father, I believe." Evelina paused, then nodded. "Yes, though I admit he wasn't always easy. Father liked control of people, of the house, even of the garden." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And what about his business affairs? Was there tension there as well?" Evelina set the teacup down a little too quickly. I wouldn't know. Father didn't speak to me about such things. But someone else might have known." The young woman gave a barely perceptible nod. "Gavin might. My father's solicitor. He was often here, but I don't think Father trusted even him completely. He always kept one secret back." "One secret?" "Yes," she said. "He had a key, a strange one. Small, brass, and very old. He wore it on a chain under his shirt, always. I saw it once when he fell asleep in the armchair and his collar was loose. When I asked about it, he simply said, "It opens what was never built." I thought it was one of his metaphors. He liked those. Miss Marple blinked. That's a very curious expression. What was never built? Evelina nodded slowly. I suppose he meant the bricked-up door, but I always thought it was just a piece of dramatic flair. Father liked mysteries. Miss Marple smiled. So do I, Miss Hargreaves. So do I. That night, as she sat by the window of her cottage, the moon casting pale light across the hedgerows, Miss Marple reflected on the patterns beginning to take shape. Edward Hargreaves had built a fake door, worn a strange key, and died with a wound inflicted in a way most unusual. His daughter, loyal and quiet, held her secrets close. His solicitor, discreet and formal, had not yet revealed all he knew. And yet, the clue might not lie in what they said, but in what the villagers, in their everyday gossip and carelessness, might let slip. As the wind stirred the curtains once more, Miss Marple whispered to herself, "The trick always is to look where no one else is looking, and to listen to what no one else hears." Chapter 7. The quiet stirring beneath the surface. The church bells rang softly over St. Cedric's Hill the following morning, their gentle chime rolling over cottages and hedgerows like a hymn from the past. But little Witham was no longer at peace. The death of Mr. Felix Cargill had fractured its stillness, and the village now pulsed with a nervous hum just below the surface. At the heart of this current unease sat the vicarage parlour, which now resembled more an impromptu tribunal than a humble sitting-room. The Reverend Petherbridge, flanked by his wife and a very pale Mr. Digby Ellison, had taken it upon themselves to guide the moral compass of the village in the aftermath of the tragedy. He may have been a difficult man, Digby said, nervously twisting the corner of his handkerchief, but he didn't deserve to be, well, murdered. Quite so, murmured the vicar, sipping from a teacup that trembled slightly in his hand. His death has cast a dreadful shadow over our pageant, Mrs. Petherbridge added. The garden committee's in disarray. The altar linens still haven't been picked up from the dry cleaner, and poor Mabel Rowntree fainted right in the greengrocer's yesterday. It was during this murmured lament that Miss Marple made her quiet entrance, her blue eyes as keen as ever above a grey lace collar. She offered her condolences to the group, accepted a lukewarm cup of tea, and said very little, for now. What Miss Marple had been doing, of course, was what she did best, listening, observing, and stitching threads of information into patterns no one else seemed to notice. She had already spent the morning calling on Miss Edith Braithwaite, whose sharp tongue and knitting needles often provided a reliable pulse on the village. "Didn't I tell you something was off about that Cargill man?" Edith had said, as she flicked a strand of wool. "Wouldn't join the flower rota, always making sly little remarks. And that awful business with the Holloway girl's inheritance." Miss Marple had listened politely, nodding, her fingers occasionally tracing the embroidered hem of her handkerchief. Now, seated in the vicar's parlour, she turned her attention to Digby Ellison. He was still pale, though not entirely from grief, Miss Marple thought. She had watched him closely the previous evening after Felix's body had been found. There had been fear in his eyes, yes, but also something else. Recognition. "Digby," Miss Marple said gently, "do you recall what time you left the pageant tent yesterday?" He blinked. Why, just after the third act, when Mrs. Withers forgot her lines. I stepped out for air. The tent was dreadfully stuffy. "Did anyone see you?" "Well, no, I suppose not." He dabbed at his forehead. "But that's hardly evidence of anything, Miss Marple. Surely you're not implying I—" "Oh, not at all," she said with a serene smile. "But it does help to clarify the movements of everyone. The police seem rather eager to conclude things quickly, don't they?" Mrs. Petherbridge leaned in. They say it was poison, slipped into a cup of tea. That's what the constable told Hester at the bakery. Not exactly Scotland Yard procedure, but you know how things spread. Poison. A woman's weapon, some might say. But Miss Marple had known enough men who used it quite capably. The question was not just who administered it, but why? And more importantly, how did it tie into that peculiar corridor Felix Cargill had been so interested in before his death? That, perhaps, was the most curious aspect of all. Miss Marple had made her way to the side of the old Witham Hall earlier that morning and found the corridor in question, or rather, found where it ought to have been. The row of windows where Felix had stood should have offered a view into an east corridor, and yet it opened onto a blank wall. No door, no hallway, no structural explanation. She had stood there for a long while, staring at the ivy-covered stone until a voice behind her said, "You see it too, don't you?" It was Clarissa Holloway. Dressed all in pale linen and green gloves, she seemed more composed than the others, though her eyes betrayed a certain restlessness. "My father always said that part of the house was cursed," she said with a faint smile. "Architectural errors," he claimed. "But you wouldn't believe how many stories I heard as a child. Ghosts, a hidden room, a sealed passage. Old families love secrets." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple replied. "But sometimes they don't stay buried." Clarissa tilted her head. "Do you think this has anything to do with Felix?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that Felix discovered something someone very much wanted to keep hidden, and that discovery may have cost him his life." Clarissa was silent for a long time. "You know," she said finally, "there was something odd about him recently. He'd begun asking me for old records, deeds, property transfers from the 1800s. I assumed it was for some family feud, but maybe not." "Did he mention what, precisely, he was looking for?" "No," she said, "but he kept saying it wasn't what was on the plans that mattered. It was what wasn't." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She folded her hands in her lap. "I wonder," she said softly, "if anyone ever asked why the door wasn't built." Clarissa gave her a curious look. "Most people assume such things are errors," Miss Marple continued. "But in a house like Witham Hall, built by men with money and motive, omissions are sometimes more deliberate than additions." As they parted ways, Clarissa offered a wry smile. "I do hope you solve this, Miss Marple. Frankly, I'm beginning to feel as if I'm living inside one of those Gothic novels with dreadful endings." Miss Marple, ever polite, said nothing. But as she walked back through the village, her thoughts turned dark. She felt it now, as she always did when truth hovered just out of sight, like the last stitch in an intricate embroidery. She passed Mrs. Withers sweeping her porch, the Holloway boy delivering groceries, and two women whispering outside the post office. The village was alive with stories, some louder than others, all of them waiting to be pieced together, and in the middle of it stood a dead man who had seen a corridor that didn't exist. But Miss Marple knew better. Something had existed there once, and someone had killed to ensure it stayed forgotten. Chapter 8. Another twist beneath the wallpaper. The village of Elmswood had always been prone to murmurs and mutterings, but since the death of Gregory Latham, the whispers had risen to a kind of fever pitch. Behind drawn curtains and beneath the soft rattle of teacups, theories bloomed like weeds, sudden and uninvited. Some blamed the inheritance, others the curious business of the sealed door. And a daring few whispered the word murder, though they quickly glanced over their shoulders after uttering it. But no one, not even the most vocal gossips, expected the second death. It was late afternoon when the scream shattered the illusion of calm. Miss Marple, seated in her rose garden with a half-knitted sock drooping from her needles, looked up sharply. It was the sort of scream that couldn't be mistaken, a raw, untrained cry of horror. Within minutes, half the village had converged on the ivy-wrapped cottage of Mrs. Charity Wiles, the widow who lived 2 doors down from the vicarage. Constable Peter Riggs arrived, winded from the jog, already blotched with sweat and suspicion. Miss Marple walked more slowly, but her eyes were sharp behind her lace-trimmed hat. They found Mrs. Wiles trembling in her parlour, supported by her maid Molly, whose apron was dusted with flour. The cause of the hysteria lay in the small kitchen at the back of the house. There, slumped awkwardly near the pantry, was the lifeless form of Jasper Bell. Jasper, so recently a source of simmering accusation, the man who had publicly confronted Gregory about the door and who had stormed away from the garden party red-faced and unrepentant. Now, he was cold. A kettle had boiled dry on the stove, and the air held a faintly acrid tang of burnt metal. But more pressing was the small, neat wound just behind Jasper's ear. Blood had dried in a thin ribbon down his collar. Not an accident, not a fall. A precise, deliberate act. Constable Riggs scratched his head, trying to make sense of it. Why here? Why now? Mrs. Wiles, once calmed, offered little. "He dropped by," she sniffled. "Said he needed to speak with me, urgently, about something to do with Mr. Latham. I fetched him a cup of tea. Then I heard the phone ring in the parlour and stepped out for a moment. When I came back..." Her voice cracked, and Molly silently handed her a kerchief. Miss Marple did not speak immediately. She studied the scene with the kind of interest she might show a particularly knotty piece of embroidery. Her gaze lingered on the kettle, the open window above the sink, and a crushed biscuit wrapper near Jasper's hand. Details, tiny things. "Was the back door open when you entered the kitchen, Mrs. Wiles?" she asked gently. "No, it was shut." Mrs. Wiles frowned. "Though, I suppose anyone could have slipped in while I was on the telephone. It was only a minute or two." A minute or two? Long enough, Miss Marple thought, if the killer was confident, practiced, or desperate. Riggs sighed. "We'll have to inform the inspector and search the area." The villagers began to drift back to their homes as word of Jasper's death spread. Fear had begun to bloom. One murder in Elmswood was shocking. 2, in such short succession, suggested something much darker at play. Miss Marple returned home slowly. The breeze carried the scent of late summer, lavender, soil, and underneath it all, unease. She set her knitting aside and instead took out a small notebook. Not to write in it, not yet, but to look at a small note she'd scribbled weeks ago. It read, "Latham, bricks laid where no door was ever meant to be. Why seal what was never opened?" She tapped the page with her finger. Jasper had known something. That much was now clear, and someone had silenced him before he could say it aloud. That evening, the vicar's wife held a subdued supper for a few of the village regulars, partly out of habit, partly out of a nervous need to gather and compare fears. Miss Marple was in attendance, as was Mrs. Edgecombe, the doctor's wife, and Mr. Finchley, the schoolmaster. "It's madness," Mrs. Edgecombe declared, her spoon clinking against her untouched soup. "Elmswood's always been safe. We haven't had a single proper scandal since the vicar's niece ran off with the circus." Mr. Finchley adjusted his spectacles. "We ought to consider that these deaths might not be connected at all. Perhaps Jasper had enemies unrelated to the Latham affair. 2 men involved in the same business dying within a week of each other." Mrs. Edgecombe raised a perfectly arched brow. "You must be joking." Miss Marple said nothing. She sipped her soup quietly. As conversation swirled around her, she thought back to something peculiar. At Gregory Latham's garden party, when Jasper had accused the deceased of lying about the sealed door, it was the expression on Mrs. Latham's face that struck her. Not alarmed, not confused, but almost satisfied. She remembered how Mrs. Latham had hovered at her husband's shoulder, silent, watchful. Later that night, long after supper had ended, Miss Marple walked alone in the village. The moon was high, casting silver light across the cobbled lanes. She passed the old post office, then the darkened window of the bakery, and finally paused near the Latham house. The police tape fluttered faintly in the breeze, marking the rear entrance. A constable had been posted earlier, but he was gone now, probably recalled after Jasper's death. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the garden and looked toward the spot where the curious door had once been. She could see where the paint no longer matched, where brick had been laid to mimic the facade. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small compact torch. The light was dim but sufficient. Slowly, she approached the wall and pressed her fingers to the sealed bricks, still faintly damp. Fresh. Her gaze dropped to the soil beneath it. Something disturbed it. A boot print? No. Smaller. A woman's heel. Then she noticed a small glint beneath the rose bush. Leaning down carefully, she brushed away the leaves and found a button. Not an ordinary button, but a decorative one, silver with a tiny red crest etched on the surface. Very expensive. Very specific. Pocketing it, she turned away just as a shutter clattered nearby, echoing through the stillness. Someone was watching. But Miss Marple, as ever, walked calmly back to her cottage, her mind quietly assembling the threads. 2 dead men. 1 sealed door, and now a button lost by someone who had no business being near that wall. She smiled faintly to herself. The killer, she suspected, was beginning to make mistakes. Chapter 9. Miss Marple's Final Test. The September light slanted golden through the ivy-covered windows of the vicarage drawing room, catching the flecks of dust that danced in the air. Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace with her embroidery in hand, looked, as always, completely at ease. But inside, her mind ticked with quiet precision. There had been too many contradictions, too many inconsistencies for her liking. Lieutenant Everleigh's evasiveness about his past, the vicar's misplaced concern over the church records, the odd, missing door that had stirred something deep in her memory. Miss Marple knew the time had come for a subtle confrontation. She had invited 3 of the key players, Reverend Partridge, Lieutenant Everleigh, and Mrs. Beryl Marchmont, to tea at the vicarage that afternoon. It was under the pretext of settling nerves and restoring village spirit, of course. No one suspected the true purpose behind her gentle eyes. "Do try the scones, Lieutenant," she said, nudging the plate forward. "I always feel scones taste best when shared under a bit of pressure, don't you agree?" The young man laughed, though it came a beat too late. "Pressure, Miss Marple." "Oh, yes," she said lightly. "Like murder in a village, and all these ghastly little secrets starting to spill out. It reminds me of a dear girl I knew in St. Mary Mead. Murdered in the middle of her own garden fete, poor thing. It's remarkable how much people will do to avoid disgrace or exposure." Beryl Marchmont stiffened, her cup rattling against its saucer. "Is this truly necessary, Jane?" "Oh dear, Beryl, forgive me," Miss Marple said with practiced innocence. "I've spent too many hours listening to unpleasant stories, but you must admit the incident of the missing church door is rather symbolic, don't you think? A whole entrance, bricked up and forgotten. Almost as though someone wanted it erased." Reverend Partridge cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "I've told you, Miss Marple, the door was sealed before my time. It's not uncommon for older parishes to wall off unused passages. Structural integrity, you see." "Quite," Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "And yet, curious that Miss Beryl here remembers attending services where that door was in use. Isn't that right?" Beryl's pale face grew paler. I must have remembered it wrong." "It was decades ago, after all." "No," said Miss Marple, setting down her embroidery. "I don't believe you did. In fact, I think you remember it very well, because it was the night you saw someone slip through it. A man, carrying something that shouldn't have been in the church at all. Lieutenant Everly looked sharply at Beryl. What is she talking about? But Beryl remained frozen. Her hands trembled, eyes fixed on the rug. Miss Marple leaned forward, lowering her voice. You saw your brother, didn't you, Beryl? The night the fire broke out. You saw him drag something through that door, the iron strongbox from the vestry. He never reported it missing, and the fire destroyed much of what was left. But you knew. You've kept that secret all these years. A pin dropped could have been heard in the silence that followed. It wasn't theft, Beryl whispered. He thought the records would implicate someone. He was protecting a friend. I don't know who. I never asked. Reverend Partridge stood. This is absurd. You're insinuating what exactly? That depends, Miss Marple said gently, on who needed the records destroyed and who stood to lose the most if certain financial misdeeds came to light. Records of money paid under false names, or perhaps letters filed by mistake, revealing connections between military personnel and less savory individuals. Everly's face changed, barely perceptibly, but Miss Marple saw it. A flicker of panic quickly masked. You said something curious, Lieutenant, she continued, about knowing Mrs. Hargrave only in passing. But Mrs. Hargrave spoke of you by name to her niece, and she did so with familiarity, almost as though she knew too much. Everly stood. This is preposterous. You're accusing me because I spoke to an old woman in a shop. No, Miss Marple said, her tone mild. I'm accusing you because Mrs. Hargrave told someone, her niece perhaps, that she had written a letter to the War Office. About you. That she had found inconsistencies in your record, and because that letter never arrived. He said nothing, his jaw clenched, but Miss Marple had her answer. You were in the church that night, weren't you? She asked softly. You knew the bricked-up door would give you a way in and out without being seen. You confronted Mrs. Hargrave about the letter. She refused to be silenced, and so you pushed her, whether in rage or fear, only you know. The fall killed her. Lieutenant Everly's fists were clenched. You can't prove any of this. No, said Miss Marple calmly, but I imagine the missing letter might still be in the fireplace ash bin, torn up but not entirely destroyed. And Reverend Partridge's ledgers, though scorched, might yield the name that was erased from your records. Perhaps the police will piece it together. They have more patience than most give them credit for. Beryl spoke then, her voice low. He told me he was protecting a friend. He lied. Miss Marple's expression softened. We often do the wrong thing for the right reasons, but murder, my dear, can never be excused. The clock struck the hour. No one moved. At last, the lieutenant broke the silence. I didn't mean to, She wouldn't stop talking. She threatened to ruin everything. My career, my father's name. Miss Marple sighed. Yes, and so you removed her. But the truth, Lieutenant, has a curious habit of seeping back in, like damp through old mortar, and no bricked-up door can keep it out forever. Outside, the wind stirred the last of the summer roses. The vicar's cat leapt down from its perch, padding silently from the room. Miss Marple, still seated, returned to her embroidery. Would anyone care for another scone? She asked, as though nothing had happened at all. Chapter 10. The door that wasn't built. The sitting room at Cherry Tree Cottage was quiet, save for the low crackle of the fire and the gentle clink of Miss Marple's teaspoon against her china cup. Inspector Craddock sat across from her, brows furrowed, still digesting the events of the past day. It had all happened so quickly. Revelations, confessions, and finally, justice. Would you mind, he said at last, going over it once more, just for my peace of mind? Miss Marple gave a small, indulgent smile. Of course, Inspector, though I dare say you saw quite a bit of it yourself. Still, the subtler points can sometimes get lost in the commotion. She set her cup down carefully. You see, the key was never just about who could have done it. It was about who knew things they shouldn't have, such as the layout of the vicarage, specifically the door that never existed. Craddock leaned forward. That was quite the moment. When you said the door that wasn't built, I thought you'd taken leave of your senses. Miss Marple chuckled softly. It did sound a bit odd, didn't it? But I remembered a conversation from the garden party, something Mrs. Bantry said in passing. She mentioned the vicarage had planned renovations but had run out of funds, and one of those changes was to be a second entrance to the rear study. That entrance was never added. Yet when dear Mrs. Denholm described her sighting, she insisted she saw someone exiting through a door at the back of the study. Craddock nodded slowly. Which meant either she saw something impossible, or she was lying. Exactly, Miss Marple said. And why would she lie? The answer is simple. She needed to misdirect attention. She wanted everyone to believe the killer had escaped unseen, that the crime had an air of mystery. But why kill Roger Calthorne at all? Craddock asked. He was a harmless historian. Harmless to most, but not to someone with something to hide. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Roger had recently discovered a collection of correspondence between Eliza Hargrave, an ancestor of Mrs. Denholm, and her alleged illegitimate child. That child had been raised in secrecy, but the letters suggested a transfer of a considerable inheritance. A scandal, if proven. Roger, with all his righteous naivety, confronted Mrs. Denholm not out of malice, but to confirm his findings. He planned to present them during his next historical lecture, perhaps not knowing the implications. So she panicked. She did, Miss Marple nodded. But what made it tragic was the cold calculation. She planned the entire scene, invited him to her home under the guise of showing old documents, poisoned the wine, arsenic, I believe, then made sure to arrive later to discover the scene. She even staged the missing book, The Genealogy of St. Luke's Parish, to make it seem the motive was theft. Craddock sighed. And the hidden clue, the mud on the carpet? A classic, really, Miss Marple said. Only 2 guests had mud on their shoes, Mr. Piggott, who had been walking the grounds with his dogs, and Mrs. Denholm, who claimed she'd arrived directly from the train station. But the train platform was paved, as you confirmed. Her muddy heels suggested she had been elsewhere before arriving. She'd gone back home to dispose of evidence and change, then returned with a rehearsed story. The inspector rubbed his temples. It's always the ones you least suspect. Oh, I suspected her the moment she tried to be too helpful, Miss Marple said gently. People with nothing to hide don't over-explain. There was a pause before Craddock chuckled. You've got an iron trap for a mind, Miss Marple. I'll be glad to write this one up with your guidance, though, of course, I'll take the official credit. Miss Marple smiled modestly. That's quite all right, Inspector. I'm quite used to being in the background. The village of Lillinghurst settled again, like a stirred pond returning to stillness. The scandal lingered on the lips of the gossips for weeks, but in time it faded, as all things do. The church held a memorial for Mr. Calthorne, and Mrs. Denholm, awaiting trial, was transferred to a prison in Oxford, and Cherry Tree Cottage resumed its peaceful rhythm. Roses bloomed again under Miss Marple's careful hand, and the birds returned to her feeder without fear. Yet one morning, as she pruned her clematis, a letter arrived, a simple cream envelope, postmarked from London. Inside was a note from Lucy Denholm, the great-niece. Miss Marple, I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. I'm still struggling to believe it myself. Thank you for seeing what no one else did. Yours, Lucy. Miss Marple folded the letter and looked up at the sky, thoughtful. In the quiet of her garden, she whispered to no one in particular, It's remarkable, really, how murder is so rarely about hatred, and so often about fear. And with that, she returned to her flowers, snipping, tying, and trimming, ever so gentle, ever so precise, just like her justice, quiet but deadly.